My name is Patrick Ewers, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mindmaven. We're a coaching organization that focuses on helping leaders, specifically in the startup world, free up 10 to 12 hours by changing the way they work with a EA or a chief of staff. And more importantly than that, we actually then try to utilize that time to get people to invest into relationships, because we think that you don't know a single person has been able to reach their fullest potential without help from others. It's a state that doesn't exist. So we're excited to have another distinguished guest with us today to talk again about the topic of human first leadership. But I also wanted to point you to the other awesome conversations we already had with Nick Mehta, the CEO of Gainsight, as well as Noah Glass, CEO of Olo. And you can find those links on those videos on our blog at mindmaven.com. But without further ado, today I'm joined by Sean Byrnes, who previously co-founded companies like Flurry and Outlier. So hi, Sean.
Hello,
Join us.
hello.
I think those were two analytical companies, right? Analytic software companies that you started. But I think the more interesting thing is that you have a fantastic story of why you started those companies in the first place. And so I was introduced by a very old time connection of mine, and basically pointed me to Sean and says he's one of the most human first leaders you'll find anywhere in the startup community. So I'm absolutely excited and thrilled to have you here. And I would say let's get going. What do you say, Sean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun. You're right. All of my companies have been in the data analytics space, but it's ironic because I'm not really a data analytical guy. I kind of fell into it through finding other problems. But if you take a step back even from that, why did I get into startups in the first place? I didn't have this dream of putting better charts and graphs in front of people or processing data at larger volumes. I was just frustrated that all the jobs that I looked at, all the jobs I had, they didn't really treat the employees like people. I didn't feel like anybody saw me as a person. They saw me as a widget or a robot, and they'd give me a salary, and I would hand them back productivity. And I wanted to work somewhere I felt like saw me as a person, where I could grow and be creative and challenge myself and evolve and be open and communicate. And eventually I just realized that if I wanted to work a place like that, I had to start it myself, because there just weren't a lot of places like that in the world. That's how I got started in the startup world. I know a lot of founders, they want to get rich or famous or powerful, and I just wanted to create jobs that I would want to have, which I know sounds strange, but it ended up being the motivating factor between all my companies that I've started.
I think that's awesome. I think I hope more people would want to follow you on that path in some form or other. So when you started, what were a few things that you did differently? And then B, what did you learn?
Well, that's the benefit of being a multi-time founder. You get to try these things multiple times. And what I like to tell people is at Flurry, my first company, there's a lot of things that I think I did right by accident. And the second time around at Outlier, I did them right on purpose. And it's interesting how that can be both a good and a bad thing. So I'll give you one example, which is I've always believed very strongly that diversity is important in companies. And I grew up in New York, a very diverse place. And so when I started Flurry, I was always very uncomfortable in rooms that were very homogenous. And so I was more comfortable in a more diverse group. So I hired a diverse team. I couldn't have told you why I thought that was an important aspect of the business. It just felt like what I wanted to do. And then with Outlier, I had learned through Flurry that a diverse team is...
Just to make sure I understand that right, if I may jump in. You basically did this at Flurry not with a plan in place. You just did it because that's who you were, what you were comfortable with, and you ended up with a diverse team around you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, but over time through Flurry, I realized that because we had a more diverse team, we had more creative ideas, we were more resilient, there was a lot of ability to overcome grit. I mean, Flurry became the kind of company that when the financial crisis hit, we survived and thrived in a world that many other companies were failing around us. And those lessons became the foundation of Outlier, where diversity became a core strategic initiative, where we realized a more diverse team can be more successful. And I had reasons I could explain to you why it was important. And that was a good thing. In other ways, it's harder though. So at Flurry, your first company, you're a first-time founder, you go into this with a lot of optimism, a lot of belief in yourself and belief in what the journey will be like. And the second time around, you know what the journey will be like. You know just how hard it will be. You lose a lot of that. I don't want to call it naive optimism because it's not that naive, but the optimism is replaced with a little bit of cynicism. And that part I don't think is good. I think that natural optimism is important to overcome. The world is cynical. It wants to pull you down. So keeping that optimism afloat is important. And it's hard, though, because your team looks to you. Your team looks to you as a leader. If you're optimistic, they'll be optimistic. If you're cynical, they'll be cynical. And so there's some aspects of being a first-time founder that I found to be better and easier, and some aspects of seven-time founder that were better and easier. But in the end, this is the other reality of companies, man. They're all made of people, and people don't change. And so I think that if you can get better at the startup journey over time, what it means is you're getting better at the people of the business. And so the more you do it, the better you get at it. The great shame of our business and technology startups is if you're successful, you make a lot of money, a lot of people don't want to do it anymore. And I think it's a shame because just when you've gotten good at the business of people, you check out and go do something else, which is really, I think it's a shame.
So tell me, basically the first time you had diversity sort of by accident, as you say, or by design of who you are. The second startup, you basically says, we're going to basically intentionally build diversity into the business. Did you end up having the same experiences, or is there a difference? Was there something different?
It was similar. It was very, in terms of the benefits we got were the same overall. And in fact, what I found eventually was that, and I'm sure you've seen this, which is if you can create a really healthy team, that can include diversity, it can include transparency, communication, but also just an aspect of respect. Do people respect you? Do you respect them? If you can create that nugget of a team, it becomes a little bit like a self-perpetuating cycle where it pulls in more people who want to be respected, who want to be seen as a person, who value these sorts of things. And so I think a lot of people think about organizations and people as this like system where I have to create a recruiting process and squeeze a bunch of people on top of my funnel and hopefully enough people come out the bottom of the funnel and I grow my team. I think about it differently. If you can create that central core that represents what you want to be, it becomes gravity. It starts to pull people in. But you work with a lot more companies. Have you found that to be true? That's been my experience, but my sample size is quite small.
Well, I think the thing that I just was going to react to what you said is I believe that there's a big craving, especially right now, in when you basically take a significant time of your life and commit it to something, is that you want to enjoy doing it, that you want to do it in a way that doesn't feel effortful, but actually like fulfilling. And many of the work environments are actually environments where you almost cannot be yourself, right? And in fact, when you can't be yourself, you have to put up something else, and that costs a lot of energy, like mental energy, but also even physical energy. And it takes away from the actual pure enjoyment you can have when you work with a team where you can actually be yourself. And so I'm wondering, have you noticed when you led this more diverse group, just because people were so diverse, were they capable of being more themselves? Was it almost like an understanding? Is that one of the benefits that you saw?
I don't think it was because of diversity, though. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to your attitudes and your approach that lead to a more diverse team are probably more the cause of those things. So, for example, being transparent. So people can't trust you unless you trust them first. Are you going to be transparent as a leader? Are you going to share things that are uncomfortable with them and trust that they can understand them in a way that many leaders do not? In terms of communication, do you accept feedback from the team, criticism, or are they not allowed to critique or criticize you? Do you take that feedback and do something with it, or you just throw it away? There's aspects of how you lead that I think create that environment, but I will say this, there were many people at Outlier that described it as the best job they've ever had. And it wasn't because the business was the best, fastest growing business ever, it made them all rich, and it wasn't even because we paid the best. In some ways, it was the first time they really started to see an organization that worked differently, that was willing to go the extra mile. And I think that is unfortunately far too rare. To your point about people, we celebrate the grind, we celebrate the ability to persevere. But a lot of people have never seen an alternative. They've never seen a company that's well functioning, that treats their employees with respect and trust. And I don't know about, I'd be interested to hear your experience. My experience is once you open their eyes, all of a sudden now they realize that there is a world. They can be more demanding, not just in the job you're giving them, but the future jobs they might have, because now they know that it's not asking too much. Whereas before they were like, this is a job and I'm supposed to be miserable in my job, so it's okay to be miserable. The company's going to lie to me, so it's okay that the company lies to me. And all of a sudden, you show them a different world, and it opens up doors.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Before I answer your question or respond to that, I actually want to dig in deeper with you. I have so many thoughts on it, but I am almost certain, like what you just said, is a dream for a lot of people listening right now, right? Like yes, I want that as well. Like of course. So, how does that look in pragmatics? You gave a few tips. Like one was basically being transparent, right? Developing an environment of trust and so forth. But what else? What else have you done that you think is fundamentally different than the archetype of a company?
It's hard to say because it's a very good question. I don't know that I have the best responses to it, although I have asked my former employees about that. Because I think one of the challenges of a leadership style, even if you get coaching, even if you do 360s, a lot of the aspects of your personal coaching leadership style, you don't see them because they're part of who you are. And it's often hard to compare that with other leaders because I've been a CEO for many years. It's been a long time since I've worked for another CEO, and even then I've only seen so many. So none of us have kind of a survey of the world. But I'll say things that I believe I do differently than most CEOs. One is around radical transparency. So everything in the company, the good news, the bad news, the performance, everyone else's performance is available. Everybody can see it at all times, which requires a lot of, frankly, intestinal fortitude. Because you have to trust your team will take bad news and not freak out and quit and find a new job, that they'll understand bad news and understand the context that you give them. Likewise, I think it's also very common for leaders.
No, stick to this. Sorry, I have to jump in. Do you have an example?
Yeah.
Do you have an example of a moment where you're like, God, that was radical transparency?
And in the early days of all of my companies, all of the compensation of everybody who worked there was available for everybody to see it. So you can see what everybody else is being paid and how much equity they have. And there's a point where you scale the company where you can't do that anymore for logistical reasons that we can get into. But in the early days, there was no wondering, is this person sitting next to me doing the same job getting paid more or less? How much do they own? Everything was transparent. Everybody knew that. And a lot of leaders are afraid of that because they're worried, well, what if somebody doesn't like how much they're being paid? Or what if I am paying somebody more than somebody else? Do I want them to know? So it forces you to a higher standard. Being that transparent means you can't cut corners. You really have to live up to whatever ideals you're putting forth because everybody can see if you're lying.
Yeah, okay. Awesome. But I interrupted you. We're going to go somewhere.
Oh, yeah. No, it's. I was talking about, I think a lot of leaders, it requires a lot of confidence to let your team solve problems in a way that is different than how you would solve the problem. So it's much more common for leaders to say, here's a problem, team, here's how I want you to solve it, go off and do that. Versus, here's a problem, I have an idea about how I'd approach it, but I want you to find the best solution. Even if it's something that wouldn't occur to me. Even if I think it's a bad idea on the surface, because again, it's different than what I would have done. Because you're essentially letting your team have a lot of slack. Maybe they make mistakes. Maybe they should have done it the way you wanted. But most of the time, I find they surprise you by finding really interesting, innovative solutions to things that wouldn't be obvious. But again, it requires a lot of confidence in yourself and in your team to be able to do that. But all of a sudden, when you do that, the team's like, wow, I've never really been given the chance to show what I can do before. I've never been, again, treated like a person who has their own ideas. And I have ideas, and I've been waiting years to show how I think they can work. And this is my chance. Those sorts of things really unlock a whole new side of people in a way that I always found really magical.
Yeah, and do you have an example of something where you've done that?
Yeah, I it's funny because one of my employees of Flurry, he wrote this great blog post about my leadership style, and the way he described it was I made him race death matches against himself. And so there were a few cases, like for example, we're building new product, new features. And Flurry was a mobile applications company. So we built analytics and advertising tools for people who made iPhone apps and Android apps and games and whatnot. And often there were a lot of challenges because new phones are coming out all the time, and new apps the app platforms are changing. And how do you keep up with that all? How, as a platform company, can you always be at the cutting edge? And I had some ideas of how we could design our platform, design the developer experience to get there. But I was like, I talked to the team. I said, listen, I think I know how I would do this, but I don't care about that. I want you to tell me how you're going to do this. How are we going to keep up with how fast phones are coming out, how fast the platforms are changing, and how do we make sure we're always at the cutting edge of it? And it's funny because for me, that sounded like I was empowering them. It sounded to me in the inside like, hey, Sean is giving them a chance to solve this somewhat very interesting product, technology, business model problem. To them, it was like, oh man, Sean knows the answer. We don't know the answer. We got to go figure this out. Like, this is a test. And so they felt an amazing amount of pressure that was in some ways intimidating because they thought I had an answer and I was testing them. But in some ways it was liberating. And the way we ended up handling this kind of somewhat complicated product, technology, business model question ended up being very different than the way I would have done it. But it was vastly successful. I mean, at its peak, Flurry was working with 2 million apps, which was about 98% of all the top 1,000 apps in any given category. It was a dominant platform. And a lot of that was because of those ideas that were not mine, that would never have occurred to me, that I probably would have shot down because I'm like, that's not my idea, and therefore it's not a good idea, had I done that kind of later.
Oh, interesting. And why would the people that followed that basically feel like that made the experience more human?
Well, I think it's at some point the question ends up being, if you want to be seen as a human, right? Do you, at what stage, a robot, you tell it exactly what to do, every step along the way. And and there are many jobs, and I'm not criticizing them, there's many jobs that are like that, where the human is essentially an instruction system, where you give it a set of instructions and this is what it does. And on the other side, you have like the pure human aspect of creativity and creation from nothing, which is like the core art, for example, the core human activity. And in the middle is kind of a spectrum. And I don't think there's a universal answer. Some people want to be treated in certain levels of the spectrum. Some people would be uncomfortable if you didn't tell them enough structure of what to do. Other people really want to. So part of it is realizing that nobody's the same, that everybody has a different place they want to be on there. And so creating an environment where there's flexibility. But the second part is also challenging people in unexpected ways. So many companies, they want to hire you because you've done something and they want you to do it again. In very rare cases are they coming to you and saying, listen, you're a person, you can grow, you can learn, given a new problem, you can probably figure it out. So show us, demonstrate how you can do it. And it shouldn't be a radical concept, but it really sometimes is if you think about it. Because often, again, employees aren't thought of as people. They're thought of as a widget that's job is to achieve a certain goal. And I need a set of widgets that I arrange in a certain way to achieve a certain outcome. It just doesn't leave room for growth or personal expression or challenges or taking risks. These things that are part of, I think are part of the human experience. Yeah,
okay, awesome. Do you have a third one? So we talked about transparency, right? We talked about empowerment. Is there something else that you have in your coffer that you really think is powerful?
The last one I'll throw out there is communication. You think about most organizations. How does communication happen? Once it gets to 10 people, everybody can sit in a room or on one chat and communicate. But what happens when it's 100 people? How does somebody in sales talk to somebody in engineering? Typically, a request goes up the org chart and across the org chart and down a different org chart. Yeah. And that means that there's no human connection between the salespeople and the engineering team or the customer success team and the product managers. Because everything in communication in these organizations is designed around the org chart instead of being designed around the people. And there are reasons why, again, I'm not criticizing it, there's very functional reasons why you want to do that in terms of making sure leadership is in the loop and making sure you have systems of these things. But in some ways, if you can find ways to let people connect directly, And you're not you trust them that it won't devolve into chaos. You really trust them and make it clear, listen, I want you to connect, but I don't want to create all sorts of multi-layer, shadow processes and shadow organizations. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure we can work together as one large team. All of a sudden they become owners of the organization as much as they are subjected to the org chart. And so now all of a sudden, instead of worrying about managing the bureaucracy of how communication is supposed to flow, they can be empowered to figure out better ways to make communication flow. And so
do you have specific things you've done in either of your startups?
So every company I've ever worked at, what ends up happening because of this org chart process is there's this one person, and she's like the expert in this. And so if you have a problem, you know to talk to Sally, because Sally is the one who figures this out. Yes. Because the actual process is too onerous, and so everybody just knows Sally is the person. So we go around the process to Sally, and all of a sudden Sally's overwhelmed. Yes. There was a great case of this with Southwest Airlines, actually, and that there was a woman whose job it was to translate all of the maintenance records into the specific codes for what maintenance needed to be done on the planes. And she was just the person who did it. And when she retired, there was nobody to fill it in. And there was no record of how she had done it. She had always been that person. Nobody remembered a time before she was that person. All of a sudden, they couldn't really do maintenance in the same way anymore. And it became a big challenge. Whereas if you give your team ownership of it and say, listen, we don't want in the world where Sally, the weight of the world's on Sally's shoulders because she has to answer every question. All of a sudden, they start thinking about this, saying, okay, cool. If we were Sally, how would we want it to work, right? How would we want the team to work together? How can we make sure that you understand, somebody who is looking for Sally, why maybe you shouldn't look for Sally anymore? Maybe I shouldn't, for example, if you have this problem, I shouldn't always say, oh, go talk to Sally, go talk to Sally. Maybe I should have that conversation and then ask Sally so I start to inherit some of her knowledge so I can answer you the next time. And so in Trusting People, we had that happen, where you remove these kinds of like oracle problems, because all of a sudden everybody in that team has ownership of it. And instead of just handing it off or looking for shortcuts in the bureaucracy, you're like, hey, how can we together build something better? And that ownership only happens if people really feel empowered that way.
Okay. All right. That's fair enough. All right. Let's wrap it up maybe with something that you can give our listeners here that is maybe sort of like a very pragmatic tip that is almost like a day-to-day thing. What's the one thing you recommend everybody should do almost on a day-to-day basis to let people feel like they're not a widget but a human?
I think the best thing you can possibly do is be very intentional about life. So a lot of people are used to the grind of I have a job and the job is giving me tasks. I achieve those tasks and I hope I'll get promoted, or I look for a job and I hope I'll get, instead of sitting down and saying, okay, what is the best that I can do and where do I need to grow and improve? And can I have a discussion with my company about that? Can I have a discussion with them about not just what they want from me, but what I want from them and where I want to, and everybody asks the question, where do you see yourself being in 5 years? Instead of that kind of generic question, can we think about, listen, this is what I'm good at today and this is what I want to be good at tomorrow. And is there a way for us to make that part of my job so I can feel like I'm growing at the same time I'm doing my job? And I think this is the great failure of most companies, is they use performance reviews to devolve people into numbers. Can we elevate people above that and say, listen, just like the organization is asking things of you, you can ask things of the organization. You can say, these are the ways I want to grow. And the organization in return can ask you about ways that it needs you to grow. And if we create a conversation, all of a sudden, hey, you know what? Who has conversations? People have conversations. And you're not a number anymore. You're not just an algorithm. All of a sudden, you're a person in a conversation with the organization, and they're going to see you in a way that was difficult to see you when you were a number.
Yes, and I think the powerful thing about that is that people then, of course, feel more like humans, but more important than that is that they will feel within the organization, within that team, understood. Exactly. Right? They feel like people understand them. People, listened. And when you listen, you basically give one of the ultimate gifts that a human can give to another human, that is feeling like they're being heard. And so I think that is definitely a very powerful way to go about it. Yeah. Well, Sean, thank you so much for being here. This was an
Thanks for
awesome,
having me.
quick, 25, 30-minute conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I know that our viewers will do too.
Oh, thanks for having me. And these conversations are important. I think, yourself and myself, and the more of us that can talk about these things, the more people we can open their eyes and hopefully show the world that there is a different way of operating that is better in a lot of ways.
I absolutely agree. Thank you.